All right, so last week we talked about the kind of emergence of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Reformation in England during the latter half of the 16th century and the 40-year reign of Queen Elizabeth, the last of our Tudor dynasty. And we made it into the beginning of the 17th century, and a ton of stuff happens in the 17th century between 1603 and 1660. A lot of stuff happens during those 60 years, and I'm going to stop. Okay. So some of the things that happen during the 16th century, or the reign of the Stuart kings, and the Stuart kings to the beginning of the English Civil War. I'm going to grossly oversimplify some of these things, but we have, of course, in 1603, the death of Queen Elizabeth and the ascension of James the First, who last week I misspoke and said that it was Mary Tudor's son. It is not. It is Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin's son, and he is a cousin of Elizabeth. So, anyways, he is her nearest relative, and he is the first of our Stuart kings. In 1605, there's not an ease of power here, and there's the gunpowder plot, which is a failed attempt to blow up the king and parliament by Catholic conspiracists. In 1607, and I put this in here just because it's important to us as we live in the great state of Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and Jamestown is the first permanent colony established by the English, named after their king at the time, James. In 1625, James dies and his son Charles takes the throne. In 1642, there is an outbreak of civil war, the theaters close, and basically all all literature pretty much stops except for the literature that's religious in nature. In 1649, Charles the First is executed, and the beginning of the Commonwealth happens. And then in 1660 is the end of the Commonwealth, the restoration of the monarchy, and the ascension of Charles II. So I'm going to stop here today, and next week we'll talk about the kind of execution of Charles I and the beginning of the Commonwealth when we talk about Paradise Lost by John Milton. So anyways, a little bit about James the First. After 4 decades of Elizabeth's rule and this kind of golden age, we know she dies childless and leaves the throne to her cousin, James I, the son of a Catholic Scottish Mary, Queen of Scots, or Bloody Mary. But he wasn't raised by his mother. He was raised by the Stuart side of his family, which was Protestant. Anyways, he was in the prime of his life at 36 and had several children. So, in a lot of ways, this seemed to be kind of this promising transition of power because he already had several heirs, an heir and a spare, so to speak, which he ends up needing. However, he grew up in Scotland, which at the time had a different church, different customs, different institutions of government, and during the Tudor era, England had kind of this mixed government that shared power between the monarchy, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, or Parliament. James the First, however, didn't want to share the power of the throne, and this struggle for power between Parliament and the Crown begins and creates a rift that will eventually spurn England into another civil war. James the First is not the charismatic ruler Elizabeth was. There's some depictions of him where he's described as having a tongue that is too big for his mouth, and that he never washed his hands. So, unsurprisingly, he did not inspire the deferential awe he felt himself entitled, as he believed that kings derived power from God, not the people, and as God's chosen delegate, he deserved reverence and obedience. So he really has this staunch belief that he has the divine right to rule, and as such, he is the absolute representative of God and the people, and that makes him incredibly unpopular um, in his reign. There are two really kind of big conflicts that really define James the First's and his son Charles I's reign. But James the First believed in the divine right of kings, and traditionally English custom limited this absolutism ever since the signing of the Magna Carta. A ruler can only make laws with the consent of Parliament. And when James the First comes into power, England is in financial trouble because of things like the Spanish Armada and things like that. And James really kind of exacerbates all of this because he is wasteful. He likes to live this extravagant lifestyle. Plus, he's keeping his house, so to speak, in England and in Scotland. So it kind of takes its toll financially on the purse strings. And Parliament won't give James any more money because they don't really trust him to do anything. They don't trust him with the money. So there's also another theme to his reign, which is this kind of religious conflict with the Anglican Church or the Church of England. And we can really look at that into these three kind of sects. And one of them, the more important, I don't want to say the more important one, but the one that makes a big difference is the Puritans, who are this group of people who want to make the Church of England more Protestant and really purify the Church of England of the Catholic traditions. And a lot of people in Parliament are Puritans. There's the moderates who want to kind of maintain that religious establishment settled by Elizabeth I, and then the High Anglicans who want to make the Church of England more Catholic in organization and doctrine. So if we take a little bit of a step back, during Elizabeth's reign, there's this what's called the Elizabethan Compromise with religion, where it tames a lot of the Reformation divisive energy. There's the English Common Book of Prayer, which is this really establishes a middle ground between traditional and reformed views. The language was open to several interpretations, so that it moderates the really extreme views of the time. So most people were happy with this kind of compromising Anglican church, but of course there are those who are resistant to the new Anglican church because it really left them open to persecution. During the 1580s and 90s, Catholic priests and those who harbored them were executed for treason, and likewise radical Protestants were executed for heresy. So those who are on the outside of the cusp really greeted James the First's ascension to the throne with enthusiasm because his mom was Catholic, and he was raised in a Reformed Presbyterian tradition. So both groups felt that they could sway him to do what they wanted in terms of making changes in the church. However, neither group failed to persuade him because both, in their own way, threatened to subvert his power. And because of that, there is in 1605 this small group of disaffected Catholics who plan to blow up Parliament. They don't succeed because someone sends an anonymous letter, and the guy who's behind it all, Guy Fawkes. If you've ever seen V for Vendetta and seen that mask, that's kind of the guy who inspired all of this. But it the gunpowder plot backfires, no pun intended, and that starts James thinking about how he can kind of moderate these feelings, which we'll talk about in just a second. However, because of the failed attempt at the gunpowder plot, it heightens this kind of anti-Catholic paranoia in England, and it begins what I think is probably the most important thing to come from King James I's reign, the King James Bible. And the King James Bible really shapes and invigorates the modern English language. It was commissioned in 1611 and written by a committee, I think of like 47 people, or something like that. It's a big number. It is the best piece of literature to be written by this large amount of people, and it comes about because it is a compromise to the differences within the Church of England, and he wants, in his kind of way, to solidify his own power. And that kind of backfires in a lot of ways, which we'll talk about. However, the King James Bible brought the Bible out of the church's control and puts it directly into the hands of the people, which was what Martin Luther wanted to do all along. However, it does kind of lead to more factions in religion, and in some ways increases those religious tensions throughout England and the like. But it is, to this day, the most popular book, and it is sold more. I mean, it is the bestseller of all time, so to speak. So, anyways, some other developments of James the First. And despite his unpopularity, there really are some good things. In addition to the King James Bible, he really supported these colonial settlements. We have Jamestown in 1607, the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620, and so those are really kind of admirable things that he brings to his his claim to fame. However, despite those kind of really good things to come out of his rule, he alienates Parliament, he alienates the Puritans, and that conflict has tremendous repercussions on his death in 1625, and his son Charles I becomes the King of England. He's a supporter of the arts, and he also is married to a Catholic, though he himself is not. He acts on the same principle of absolute power with inflexibility. And he does some good in his reign. He pays off his father's debt. He wants to make these kind of really smart governmental decisions, but he refuses to work with Parliament. And that struggle with Parliament has detrimental, life threatening. I mean, Parliament kills him essentially, which we'll find out. But this struggle with Parliament really has a life-changing impact on him. So he refuses to work with Parliament, and at the time, Parliament could only be called at the bequest of the monarch, and he gets rid of them for a couple of years and calls them again, and Parliament issues this list of grievances against him, and his response is to, well, I don't need you, and he goes on this lengthy personal rule where he really um, makes all of the decisions by himself. And because Parliament is not in session to give him money for taxes and for all of his other wants and needs, he raises money by questionable means, and that becomes another grievance against him when Parliament reconvenes. But he does avoid wars to save money. However, this kind of inability to work with and refusal to involve Parliament and maintain connections to kind of these powerful individuals, he not only alienates himself from his people, he alienates himself from these important connections or channels of communication. And he further alienates Puritans. He's, like I said, he's married to a Catholic, and he's deeply devoted and attached to her in a way that his people don't really understand because they hadn't seen it in his father with his wife. But anyways, Puritans accuse him of being popish, and he appoints this guy named William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury to enforce religious uniformity. He tries to reinstate Catholic ceremonialism in the Church of England and to restore its architecture, which really highlights the altar. And that drives many Puritans to the Americas in 1630, which we know all about as, Plymouth Rock and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, riots break out all over London, and he tries to impose those same religious rules in Scotland, and there's this kind of outbreak in Scotland for war, which essentially bankrupts him, and he's forced to recall Parliament to either continue the war or to just get more financial backing. And because of that, there is what we call the Long Parliament. There's a short parliament and a long parliament, but I'm just going to talk about the Long Parliament, where James is forced to kind of work with them. And what happens during that Long Parliament is that it's dominated by Puritans, and they decide that they want to secure the rights of Parliament in the face of Charles I's absolute tendencies. Parliament abolished unapproved taxes, reined in the powers of all the bishops, arrested, tried, and eventually executes all of the ministers who support the king, and disband censorship of the day, which really opens the floodgates of treaties and all these political documents that were published weekly that editorialize various political and religious perspectives, which also further the rift between Parliament and the king. Parliament also issues its 19 propositions, which is a new government relationship, a constitutional monarchy where the king has little power and Parliament would exercise all government affairs. Charles refuses to accept the terms, and both the king and Parliament raise an army, and thus the Civil War in England begins. Charles, his supporters are the Royalists, but they're also called Cavaliers, which if you know anything about UVA, what are UVA is called? The Cavalier. Their mascot are the Cavaliers, which is a direct reference to the Cavaliers at the time of the English Civil War. He moves the capital from London to Oxford, and Parliament. Their supporters are called Roundheads, and they are largely Puritan, led by Oliver Cromwell. And that is where I'm going to stop here. And this is kind of the historical context and the groundwork that we're laying for not only this week, but into next week. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about the actual poetry that comes from the age and our poems for the week.